Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here this evening. Mr. President, fellow Tea Party members, Americans, patriots. When I was a teenager, just getting started, worrying about all of those things that teenagers worry about. Am I going to be able to live in the kind of home that my mother and father live in? What kind of job am I going to have? Am I going to be able to find a wife that's as good as my mother is? Especially one that I could bring home that she would appreciate. And my mother said to me one day, she said, life is not so difficult. We all want to live in a good neighborhood and enjoy the company of our neighbors. We want to earn more than a living wage and have the respect of our work colleagues. We want to find the love of a good woman, make her our spouse and lifelong partner, and when children come along, we want to adore our children and we want to have them admire us. She said, life is not very difficult. I was thinking on the way here tonight, politics is not very difficult. But there's a new spirit in America that the old-style politics will not satisfy. Our grandparents want the promise of security that they worked their whole lives to achieve. They want that promise kept. Parents want their children to be prepared for the jobs of the future. And our students want meaningful jobs when they graduate. We as citizens expect that a government that can run up an enormous debt should be wise enough to pay it off. And we expect our politicians and our elected officials to be wise enough and have the strength of purpose to restore this country to its standing as a world leader. I want to suggest to you tonight that Abraham Lincoln was just such a leader. Not only did he preserve the Union, that long, costly 4-year war was accomplished without saddling this country with an enormous debt. And tonight we're going to discuss the purse and the sword and how Lincoln was able to do that and what that tells us about what we should be doing today. Not only did Lincoln's monetary policy not saddle us with a debt, we launched the Bureau of Mines, the Continental Railway, new farm machinery came into existence, new tools for industry, higher education was free, government invested in all branches of the sciences, and in fact, by the end of the war, one worker could do as much work as two had been able before the war. So this leads me to the question, what is the proper role of government? As I traveled around this state for the last 2 years preparing for this run, I ran into small business after small business and family-owned business that told me that they had had regulation upon regulation piled upon them to the point where they couldn't make any money at all. And sadly, they had to curtail those businesses and the jobs that went along with them, and the impact that the income from those businesses and jobs had on the local communities. So what is the proper role of government? The proper role of government must be to maintain an equitable relationship, a balance between its constitutional responsibilities and, in the words of Lincoln, employing the better angels of our nature to do what is best for this country when faced with competing demands on limited resources. A government so dedicated and so conceived, it's still just as possible that it can be too invasive as it is that that government could be too timid. But long and bitter experience has taught us that that invasive government tramples upon our freedoms. That timid government results when we, the people, exercise our Republican liberties. George Washington said, "The marvel of all history is the patience with which men and women submit to burdens unnecessarily laid upon them by their government." burdens unnecessarily laid upon the men and women of this country by their government. That's the same George Washington that said that firearms are second only to the Constitution in importance. In this country, we, the people, exercise our decision-making powers through the process of elections. We choose to be represented by our neighbors, elected at regular intervals, to make and enact laws for the general good. We do not expect them to saddle our children and our children's children with a debt that they cannot pay. We expect our courts to uphold the Constitution, not invent a new one. And we would expect that the men and women who are out there protecting our freedoms, many of whom will pay that last full measure of devotion, should have the dignity of serving in uniforms made in the United States. In 2010, the voters of this country, enthused by the Tea Party, sent a new group of legislators to Washington, and with a clear message. The voters of this state sent a new group of legislators to Columbus and a new chief executive with a clear message. We want America back. We want back that America that understands that it is the interest of the working man with which we must be concerned. Because when the American people work, the American people save. When the American people save, the American people invest. When we work, save, and invest, America prospers. And we want back that prosperous America, and we get it back by putting America first. This is an aside, but I have to tell this story. I'm a young kid, and the minister held a contest, a writing contest. And he said, what is the job of a pastor, a reverend, a minister, a priest? What is our job? And we were all supposed to write a one-page essay. I thought about it and I thought about it. The night before the contest was due, the papers to be turned in, I took a 3x5 card and I wrote one sentence on it. So I go, with the parents, the parents are going to be there because they're going to announce the winners. And the minister got up and said, we have a problem with the contest. He said the requirement was for a paragraph about the responsibilities, what a minister does. And he said, unfortunately, and we're going to let the parents here decide whether or not we should include this one sentence, which I think is the best answer that I've ever heard. All I put on that card was, what a minister, a reverend, what a religious person does is they spend their time thinking about the mind of God. And he thought that was a reasonable answer, and I won the contest. 40 years later, I'm at Oxford University. There was a problem with critically ill preterm newborn babies. Sometimes you can't feed them, the ones born at 19, 20 weeks. I mean, this is very, very early. But as nature would have it, as God would provide, there's a substance in the body that if you can get blood flow to it, would keep these babies alive for several days without anything else. It's called brown fat, but nobody could figure out how to get blood flow. So being clever, bright, and under excellent instruction, a colleague and I discovered the solution to this problem. And the first night that we discovered this solution, I think it was about 7:30 at night, and we had to put a micro amount of electricity into some tissue, and we were watching how this process operates. And we watch it over and over, and before we know it, the sun's coming up again. And we've been sitting there all night doing this. We're the first to see this. My colleague put his hand on my shoulder and he said, I gotta go. I cannot watch this anymore. He said, this is like looking into the mind of God. And I thought to myself, what a wonderful way to spend one's life. I hope that's a good introduction to this because I'm about to say something that I believe in my heart and soul to be true. We, as a people in this country, have given up control of our money. And I'll go a step further. I have to suggest to you that it is impossible to know whether a bill or a piece of legislation or a monetary policy is fiscally responsible or not without understanding money. I suggest that that is a bridge to nowhere. So tonight we're going to talk about money. How did Lincoln pay for a 4-year war, millions of soldiers, without putting this country into debt? He went back to the Constitution, Article 1, Section 5 through 9, which gives to the Congress of the United States the responsibility for maintaining a national currency. So rather than to go to the Boston banks and borrow money at 24 or 36%, he started to print the United States note. He did not borrow money from the banks. By producing that United States note, he was able to pay for the war, pay the soldiers, and launch this country to become one of the greatest industrial powers the world had ever seen. Why are we as a nation? Every bill that you have in your pocket says Federal Reserve Note. You have in your pocket the debt of the United States. Every one of those bills is an IOU. Why aren't we printing our own money? To the extent that we are producing goods and services, it is not inflationary. Because we gave up that responsibility. In 1913, the Congress of the United States turned it over to a private corporation called the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve System is no more the United States government than FedEx is. The Federal Reserve is a private corporation registered in Delaware. Inflation is caused when there's too much money chasing too few goods. But as long as the goods and services are balanced with the amount of money in circulation, there is no inflation. The only reason there's no inflation now, with the Fed putting so much money out, $2.7 trillion in the last 2 years, they printed and put it into circulation without one act of Congress and without anybody asking the American people if that's the way we wanted to go. I suggest to you that it is time for us to go back to making Congress, as Lincoln did. Lincoln didn't write an executive order. He went to the Congress of the United States for the Legal Tender Acts of 1862. The Constitution, he said, gives you the responsibility for controlling the economy of this country, not the banks. And the Congress passed those acts, and we were not settled in debt. In 1936, Congress tried again and failed to wrestle back the control of our monetary